afternoon. Thank you for your interest in Babette's Feast and Isak Dinesen. My name is Joe McGrath. I am the artistic director and one of the founders of the Rogue Theater, and the director of this adapted production of Babette's Feast. I'm guessing that few of us would be familiar with Babette's Feast without the 1987 Oscar-winning Danish film by Gabriel Axel. Axel takes Isak Dinesen's short story, originally set in Norway, and resets it in a bleak Denmark landscape and produces it in Danish rather than the original English. Believe it or not. The film is brilliant and a touch more dramatic than the short story. Our chosen adaptation, written by Rose Courtney, is, I would argue, a little closer to the original short story, with a lighter touch, more colorful, and some more broadly comic elements. But before talking about Babette's Feast, I want to talk about its author. Karen Dinesen, Tanya, Karen Blixen, the Baroness, Scheherazade, as she signed her name sometimes, among many others, and finally to us in the English-speaking world, Isak Dinesen. The fact that this remarkable author went by so many different monikers in the course of her life is a revealing fact as to who she was. The life of Dinesen is a conundrum to explain because aside from instinctively playing all of these roles suggested by these names, she shaped her public persona to such an extent that it's difficult to separate the woman from the mask. I'm hoping to touch a bit on Dinesen in person, but a word of warning, the truth is ultimately unknowable. Karen Dinesen was born in 1885 to Ingeborg Westenholz, a Unitarian bourgeois merchant family, and Wilhelm Dinesen of Danish aristocracy. Now these two distinct influences would come to distinguish a great deal of Dinesen's life and work. Her father, Wilhelm, was a soldier, hunter, and outdoorsman with contacts to royalty, who fought in Danish and French wars against Prussia, and spent time with the Chippewa Indians in Wisconsin. He was active and worldly, eventually becoming a member of the Danish parliament, and he seems to have had a close relationship with his young daughter, Karen. But Karen, in the end, grew up mostly with her mother and siblings and her Aunt Bess. The Westenholz family was more austere and religious than were the worldly and adventurous connoisseurs of the Dinesens. And when young Karen was 9, her father, by some accounts having contracted syphilis through an infidelity, in guilt and despair of a coming life of ruin, hanged himself at the age of 50. As one can imagine, this was a profound event for his young daughter. Nevertheless, the family seemed to weather the tragedy stoically. Karen began writing and telling stories in her youth. She studied art seriously in her 20s at the Royal Danish Academy and continued her studies traveling throughout Europe. In her late 20s, she met and fell in love with a second cousin, Hans Blixen, who did not reciprocate her affections. However, she managed to respond to the advances of his twin brother, Baron Bror Blixen, and they were betrothed. The Westenholz family convinced them to manage a venture in Kenya. Come on in. The Westenholz family convinced them to manage a venture in Kenya, then colonial British East Africa, and the young couple decided to move there and make a go of it. They were married along the way, and Karen, at the age of 29 in 1913, became a baroness, a title she thereafter jealously guarded at some cost. She would spend the next 18 years in Kenya until the farm's failure in 1931. Her husband, Bror, paid little attention to the farm. Eventually, he spent much of his time out on safari. He was notoriously unfaithful, and within a year, Karen came down with a severe illness which was diagnosed as syphilis, contracted from her husband, evidently. There is some controversy about this part of her life. She seems to have believed that she was afflicted with syphilis, but some contemporary physicians have been skeptical, attributing some of her ailments throughout life to the treatments for syphilis at the time, mercury and arsenic-based drugs. As I said, the truth is unknowable. But this facet of her life shows the quality of her character. She believed in her affliction with syphilis, and she had it in common with her father, a notion she seems to have embraced. After the farm's failure, Karen Blixen returned, age 47, to Denmark, her home base for the rest of her life. It was at this time that she began writing in earnest. After her substantial time in British East Africa, she preferred writing in English, being more comfortable in that language and believing it to be a more profitable choice, the English-speaking world being far more populous than that of the Danish language. Her first success was 7 Gothic Tales. Unable to find a Danish publisher, it found success and enthusiasm in the United States in 1934. And she had it published under the pseudonym Isak Dinesen. Isak is Isaac in Danish, thus hiding her gender, which I would judge to be good marketing choice. A cold calculation that seems to fit the character of Karen Blixen. Though I can find no comment on this. Isak, in its original Hebrew, translates as God will laugh. For what it's worth. It matches Dinesen's character to be cognizant of that. Her greatest success came when she recounted her life in Africa in the popular memoir, Out of Africa. Published in 1937, it was eventually adapted in the 1985 film of that name. It was something of an elegy to colonial Africa, a white hunter's paradise, the landscape now developing out of recognition, gone with the wind, as it were. Yeah. By the way, the film with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford is very freely adapted. Dinesen's affair with Dennis Finch Hatton, though supported by her passionate writings about him, is unconfirmed and problematic, or at least complicated, given that she believed herself afflicted with syphilis. On returning to Denmark, she lived at and eventually took possession of her family estate at Rungstedland, not far from Copenhagen. Although she continued to have problems with her health for the rest of her life, her writing output was substantial in her 50s and 60s. Winter's Tales, her second collection of short stories, was published in 1942 and reflected some of the tensions of the German occupation of Denmark during World War II. There was a bit of cloak and dagger, by the way, in getting the manuscript out of Denmark and to the publishers. She produced her only full-length novel, The Angelic Adventures, in 1944, which was well reviewed. Her next important output was the short story collection Last Tales in 1957 and Anecdotes of Destiny in 1958, which contains the short story Babette's Feast, originally published in 1950, and I'll mention that later. Her final work was Shadows on the Grass in 1960, a return and expansion on Out of Africa. Dinesen was considered several times for the Nobel Prize in Literature, but it is thought that she was passed up because the judges were afraid of an accusation of favoritism in awarding the prize to another Scandinavian. Through all these years, she struggled with her health. It was eventually made plain to her doctors that for some time she had been taking strong laxatives, and on reflection there is some thought that she suffered from anorexia. She died, evidently of malnutrition, in 1962 at Rungstedland, Denmark. Tough life. As I said before, it's difficult to pin down Karen Blixen. I want to point out something here that I don't have necessarily in my... This right here is a biography by Judith Thurman of Isak Dinesen. And what's interesting is you page through this biography, on every other page, she's speaking of Tana, Tanya, Karen, Isak. You got to know a lot of names of one person to be able to follow this book. It's amazing. It's just amazing. It's difficult to pin down Karen Blixen, as she created her own legend and was prone to wearing a variety of masks. There was her preoccupation with her weight, her syphilis, her title as the Baroness, not to mention her constant return to being bedridden and needing care, which was most likely both true and served an interest for attention. As I've looked at Isak Dinesen for this talk, I found a person who was shockingly realistic and unromantic when faced with life's challenges. The woman who has stood in the Africa savannah with a rifle in her hand in the presence of lions. The same woman that said the following in a letter to her brother Thomas. I'm going to have Cindy read this quote.
If it didn't sound so beastly, I might say that the world being as it is, it was worthwhile having syphilis in order to become a baroness.
Amazing. Dinesen lived furiously, embracing and writing of vivid, adventurous lives. A favorite motto of hers was a phrase attributed to Pompey the Great in the 1st century BCE. Speaking to his sailors, setting sail in the face of a storm to bring grain to Rome, he is attributed to have said, "Navigere necesse est, vivere non necesse." It is necessary to sail. It is not necessary to live. Dinesen embraced the short story as her preferred medium, and her biography, Judith Thurman, attempts an explanation. Thurman says she took it upon herself to represent the values of the lost aristocratic world to the modern one with exemplary clarity, the clarity of a parable or a myth. And she began to chisel a public figure in which those values were dramatically embodied and stylized. The grande dame, the sibyl, the storyteller who was 3,000 years old and had dined with Socrates. Here, I think, is the tension in the household of her upbringing. The tug between her mother's family, religious and bourgeois, and her father's family of noble and aristocratic adventurers. Most of Dinesen's work is set in a lost world, the 19th century or earlier mythical settings. The thematic concerns are most often religious and philosophical. It should be kept in mind that Dinesen generally wrote myth and parable. She tended to think of herself as a storyteller above all. Her characters are driven by single concerns, for the most part, and the outcomes draw us to a philosophical perspective, if not a lesson. She tended not to write with depth or dimension of character, but made a generous use of irony and symbol. This results in a simple style that only occasionally becomes lyrical and flowing. It must be acknowledged that Dinesen was keenly aware of the tastes of her audience and wasn't above writing to it and to success. As lovely and moving a work as Babette's Feast is, for example, its origin is revealed in an exchange between Dinesen and an English friend, Geoffrey Gorham. He challenged her that she couldn't get published in the Saturday Evening Post. And she accepted the challenge. But what would the market require, she asked. Write about food. Dora told her, Americans are obsessed with food. A further irony might be that this lovely story was written by someone who spent a lifetime waging a war with food. The Post rejected it, by the way. But the Ladies' Home Journal picked it up in 1950. Now, to Babette's Feast. I want to point out here that we have Chris Mason, I guess you might have turned it off, but Chris Mason has had our northern lights going there a little bit in the background as you walked in. And this is essentially taken from the very first paragraph of the short story, this whole image. Babette's Feast, because of the Oscar-winning film I mentioned, has come to be the best known of Dinesen's work after Out of Africa. Two aging, devout sisters, Martina and Philippa, live with their French cook and housekeeper in the remote town of Berlevåg, nestled in a fjord of Norway late in the 19th century. Having set this scene, Dinesen then relates their histories in a flashback. Their father was a revered dean and leader of a pious sect of Lutherans. The ladies in their youth attracted romantic interest from young men, but the dean kept his daughters close to pursue their holy work. Enter a young lieutenant of the Hussars, Lowenheim, who, having gotten into debt and dissolution, was sent to Berlevåg to live for a while with his aunt, Mrs. Lowenheim, and straighten himself out. He sees Martina, falls in love, and presents himself to the dean. The dean invites him to a service where the purity of the atmosphere and Martina's devotion puts his own life of drunken gambling and womanizing to shame. He decides he is unworthy and departs, determined to finally make something of himself. We then encounter a famous French opera singer, Achille Papin, who, at the beginning of his career, has become despondent and come to Berlevåg for a change of scene. He happens to hear Philippa singing in the church and is swept away with a natural quality and skill of her voice. He approaches the dean to see if he will let Philippa take lessons with him. The dean permits it. Papin is deeply impressed with Philippa and wants her to return to Paris with him and become an opera prima donna. She is on the verge of relenting when, in their third lesson, they sing the seduction duet from Don Giovanni. As they come to the conclusion of the duet, Papin forgets himself and kisses her, as Don Giovanni might kiss Zerlina in the opera. Shocked with both Papin and her own desires, Philippa has her father cut off the lessons, which sends Papin packing, once again despondent, back to Paris. Several years pass. The dean has died, and the sisters carry on his work, feeding the hungry and maintaining as best they can his ministry and church. In 1871, they are visited by a refugee from the Paris Commune, Babette herself, with a letter of introduction from Papin, explaining that Babette has lost her family in the violence and has been forced to flee. For further historical background, see your essay. After an expression of longing to the grace of Philippa's voice, the letter closes with a simple, Babette can cook. Unaware of the depth of this statement, the sisters take her in and give her instruction on how to make the humble meals that they prepare and take to the disadvantaged in their community. Babette quickly endears herself to the sisters and the village at large, despite her being a Catholic. In the meantime, however, fractures begin to show themselves in the community. Petty disagreements erupt in the dean's congregation, and the devout community begins to crumble, bit by bit. 12 more years pass, and a letter arrives for Babette informing her that she has won 10,000 francs in the lottery that a friend has maintained for her all this time. At the same time, the community is about to celebrate the centennial of the dean's birth with a gathering. Babette proposes to prepare and serve a French meal for the congregation. The sisters are convinced that Babette will soon depart with her newfound wealth and don't wish to disappoint her. They cannot say no, but they are suspicious of the sinful indulgence that such a feast might represent. The day arrives. Snow is falling, and the sisters are informed that old Mrs. Lowenheim's nephew, now General Lowenheim, is visiting, and she would like to bring him to the gathering as well. The sisters agree. We then see the general at his aunt's house preparing to attend the gathering, preparing to see Martina once again after 31 years. He looks in the mirror and has a surprise. And now we'd like to give you a look at this brief scene. The carriage is ready, General, and your aunt says we should be leaving soon. The snow is falling fast.
I'll be right down.
You'll be late to dinner. Mustn't be late. Punctuality and all that. Oh, do you mind if I smoke?
Who are you?
I'm young. I'm you. I attract dreams and fancies as a flower attracts bees and butterflies.
You fled.
They followed me.
The dreams.
And I became you.
You refused the gift
Of love?
of second sight. I fulfilled your wishes. I more than satisfied your ambitions. It might be said that I have gained the whole world. I'm in high favor with royalty. I've done well in my calling. I have friends everywhere. My wife is a brilliant woman and still good looking. Yet something somewhere has been lost.
I lose things all the time. I lost my father's gold pocket watch in a bet. I lost a tooth in a drunken brawl over a woman in Amsterdam. Remember that? Oh, I lost my favorite.
This is different. I find myself worrying about my immortal soul. It makes no sense. I'm a moral person, loyal to my king, my wife, and my friends, an example to everybody. Yet there are moments
Like this one?
when it seems the world is not a moral but a mystic concern.
Vanity. Vanity. All is vanity.
I will settle my account with you, young man, tonight. I will sit at that same table where you sat mute, and I will answer any question posed to me. I will let you prove to me once and for all that 31 years ago I made the right choice.
After this, the community arrives at the sisters' house for the occasion. They sing a solemn hymn to reinforce their courage in facing this sinful, gluttonous ordeal. They resolve to make no comment about the food. General Lowenheim arrives, reflects on the grace and purity of Martina, and sits to the meal. He is immediately struck by the finest turtle soup he has ever tasted and a tremendous Amontillado sherry. As course after course of gourmet cuisine comes to the table, Lowenheim reflects on a meal he had at the Café Anglais in Paris, where the finest chef surprisingly for the time, a woman, was indulging the ruling class with the most exquisite, imaginative fare. The congregation makes no comment, but the wine and champagne loosens their tongues, and they begin to reflect on the stories and sermons of the dean. The general rises to speak, and surprisingly reiterates a sermon of the dean with embellishments that come from the moment, the food, and the magic of Martina's presence. After the meal, the community seems to bury old hatchets and once again reunites in cooperation and love as the snow begins once again to fall. This is one of the most lyrical passages in the short story. I'd like to have Cindy read it for you.
When at last the company broke, it had ceased to snow. The town and the mountains lay in white, unearthly splendor, and the sky was bright with thousands of stars. In the street, the snow was lying so deep that it had become difficult to walk. The guests from the yellow house wavered on their feet, staggered, sat down abruptly, or fell forward on their knees and hands and were covered with snow, as if they had indeed had their sins washed white as wool. And in this regained innocent attire were gamboling like little lambs. It was, to each of them, blissful to have become as a small child. It was also a blessed joke to watch old brothers and sisters who had been taking themselves so seriously in this kind of celestial second childhood. They stumbled and got up, walked on and stood still, bodily as well as spiritually hand in hand, at moments performing the great chain of beatified lanciers. Bless you, bless you, bless you, like an echo of the harmony of the spheres rang on all sides. Martina and Philippa stood for a long time on the stone steps outside the house. They did not feel cold. The stars have come nearer, said Philippa. They will come every night, said Martina quietly. Quite possibly it will never snow again. In this, however, she was mistaken. An hour later, it again began to snow, and such a heavy snowfall had never been known in Berlevåg. The next morning, people could hardly push open their doors against the tall snowdrifts. The windows of the houses were so thickly covered with snow, it was told for years afterwards that many good citizens of the town did not realize that daybreak had come, but slept on till late in the afternoon.
Lovely moment. After this, the sisters come to Babette in the kitchen to thank her and to wish her well on her return to Paris. She explains that she has nowhere to go, having lost all her family, and that she was once the chef at the Café Anglais in Paris, and prepared meals for the ruling class of France, most of whom were now gone. And besides, the 10,000 francs were all spent on the feast. Shocked, the sisters ask why she spent everything on their humble gathering. Babette explains that she is an artist, and practicing her craft to her best is what she most wants to do. The opportunity to practice her art, if only once after 12 years in exile, was worth it. The concept of divine grace runs through this particular tale. Infinite grace. The general, in a speech to the table, delivers the old dean's sermon with the statement, "In our human foolishness, we imagine divine grace to be finite. For this reason, we tremble." Another important quote of the dean's that lies beneath the entire story is, "The only thing which we may take with us from our life on earth are those which we have given away." The setting for Babette's feast is austere and religious, while the intrusions and the ultimate grace come from the wider world. This coincides with the tension which I referred to a while ago between the two sides of Dinesen's family, the religious middle class and the aristocratic world of taste and adventure. Now, the adaptation which we have chosen for this production, as I said, is by Rose Courtney. It was first performed in 2018 in Portland, Oregon, and then off-Broadway, that same production, at the theater at St. Clement's, where it was awarded a critic's pick by New York Magazine and Newsday. You will see in this adaptation a great deal of narrative. Or maybe you'll hear a great deal of narrative. Actors speaking storytelling passages directly to the audience. It's Courtney's way, I believe, of honoring Dinesen's insistence that she be not thought of as an author so much as a storyteller. There's a difficulty in using direct address narrative that we as actors have. In our training, we are always hammered into us by our teachers to show, not tell. To show us what you're doing, not telegraph to us what you're doing, but to actually show it. And that assumes that the actor has an action to show. When we place narrative in the mouth of the actor to step forward, in many ways they're not quite trained, we're not quite trained to do that. And so it's been one of the curious and challenging parts of directing this whole play is to get the actors to talk and not declaim these passages of narrative. To what I call it is take it off the page, is make it no longer written but spoken, and that's a different process, and it's a real challenge for us as actors. This play is written for a cast of 9, 3 principal parts: Martina, Philippa, and Babette, and then an ensemble of 6 players who handle the narration and all the other parts: Lowenheim, young Lowenheim, the Kili Papan, the Dean, and various other figures of the Opera House in the village of Berlevag. The ensemble players remain on stage for the bulk of the play, watching the action and furthering it with narrative interjections, or walking right into the action from the edge of the stage. It's an extremely fluid arrangement, and any scene shifts that we have are brief and only involve rearranging the benches. Now, there is a great deal of pantomime in this production, which is a skill most of us are trained in. I've heard a question from some of you that reminded me of a question we often heard about another title character a few years ago, and that question was, how are you going to do the whale? Which, of course, we were doing Moby Dick, Sydney's adaptation of Moby Dick. That kind of worked out. And we've heard the same question about this particular title character. The feast will be mimed, of course. Since the entire 6-course meal with its 7 wines and cognac itself would be impossible to stage in the time allotted for the entire play. But it's a parable, after all. And in the end, in this story, the food and table dressings are not nearly as important as what they invoke in the characters. We've spent a bit of time on establishing our mime technically, but it will be the restraint of the people of Berlevag in the face of this sinful orgy, as compared with the general shock at the quality of the food in this remote backwater, that will drive the story. Many of you will be joining us for the real feast at Doug Levy's Feast Restaurant next Sunday, or the Sunday after. Doug Levy is actually serving a recreation of Babette's Feast. It's expensive. There are 4 tickets left. You know, one of the delights of staging this particular style is that the world and its objects are what we say they are. A reality, a mind reality, need not be rigid. A mind object can materialize and disappear as needed. a table or a piano can be established. We can then walk right through it and then reestablish it. Why? Because your imaginations are powerful. And we hope to conjure your innocence to jump right in. There is a completely new challenge for the road in Babette's Feast. The great opera singer, Achille Pipin, and the dean's daughter, Philippa. These two are defined as magnificent voices, and in the lessons between them, they eventually sing La Scheherazade la Mano, often referred to as the seduction duet from Don Giovanni. It would be impossible to put this up without solid, classically trained singers who know both the opera world and the theater world. And we found them for these parts.
Oh, wow.
Kate Scally and Dennis Tamplin. They have been a treat to direct and work with, and they'll be a treat for you. Toussaint's talent can be stunning at times. La Scheherazade la Mano is an astute choice by Dinesen for the third and final lesson. Its lyric, though sexual in its objective, works quite well for a big city opera singer trying to woo a talented provincial girl to a wider world of fame and glory. So they can play both Don Giovanni and Zerlina and Pipin and Philippa at the same time. Come with me, I will change your life, he sings. She responds, I soon will not be able to resist. All in Italian, of course. The program will have a full translation of the duet. One further note. Russell Ronnebaum, as usual, has composed and will be playing wonderful music for this. Aside from the established pieces from the opera and the Lutheran hymnody, he has given us wonderful incidental music and 2 dance pieces that we have in this. This play, Babette's Feast, has been a real challenge for us. It has an earnestness that you rarely see out of the Rogue Theater, but we have always believed in the importance of being earnest. But I mean that. Wilde doesn't get to keep that phrase. Come on. We've always believed in the importance of being earnest and in our aspirations more than anything else. And so, because if you don't approach things with an innocence and with an earnest and unquestioning approach, you might very well fail. It's been important, and the earnestness of this particular production has been a real challenge. Stepping forward and just telling you once upon a time, and inviting you to jump in with us. It explains, these are the first words of our play, and it explains what you see in front of you. In Norway, there is a fjord, a long, narrow arm of the sea between two tall mountains named Berlevåg Fjord. At the foot of the mountains, the small town of Berlevåg looks like a child's toy town of little wooden pieces painted gray, yellow, pink, and many other colors. So this is the world that Dinesen has created. And Axel, in his movie, decided to move it to Denmark and make a much more bleak landscape, ostensibly to give us that religious kind of setting. So this is kind of the tension that we have between what we do on stage and what you may be familiar with in that film. Are there any questions?
I had the opportunity to speak to 2 or 3 members of the ensemble about this, and I asked them if they'd seen the film or if they'd read the book, and they had not. And they offered that, from an actor's point of view, they felt it was probably better for them to invest themselves in the role, not to read the book, not to see the film. Your opinion on that, please.
That's an individual process thing for each individual actor. You can be too influenced by another medium like a film or a book, and it may lead you away from the script you have in hand. You may suddenly start trying to play a character that's not in that script. It's somewhere else. It's in that film, or it's even in the book, and the adapter has purged that aspect out of the character. And it may not help to go there, given the script that you have in your hands. So some of us as actors are a little leery of seeing the influence of another actor playing the role that we're trying to play. And then we start doing an impression of another actor as opposed to playing the role as it hits us. And that's it's an interesting thing. I'm starting, as I get older, I'm starting to not be bothered too much by seeing other media versions of what I'm doing. But because I'm a little, you kids keep off of my lawn kind of guy. It's like, I see what Richard Burton's doing. I see what Laurence Olivier is doing. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? And so anyway, why did she pick Norway to set the story? I can't speak. Do you have a thought on that?
I do.
Yes.
It's before oil, and in the 30s, 20s, 10s, Norway was very bleak, and I have seen many of these towns that look exactly like what the set said. So it was quite bleak, and they were very poor until oil came, and now they're very rich.
Okay. So it was remote, yes. And I would venture a guess also that Dinesen loves she departs. She doesn't write she never wrote her period. She liked to write 100 years ago, long ago and far away. And so that may be another factor in all of that, is that the bleakness of that northern setting, along with the distance that Karen Dinesen, or Karen Blixen used to like to write in that way. Probably my most curious experience directing this play is directing Mozart. I've never directed opera, and I have two singers who know this duet, and they even know the classic staging of it, right? Which I had to struggle with them, and say, no, you're not Don Giovanni and Zerlina, you're Pepin and Philippa, and try and hang on to the drama that we have in the play, rather than letting them run away with the opera itself, which of course they want to sing and they know, and the other thing that's interesting is getting Kate to sing uncertainly, as someone who doesn't know how to sing opera initially, and she took to that very well. She really does understand the drama of the moment, but it's interesting to see them sing La Chitarra de la Mano as a lesson. Yeah, it's really one of the curious things about this, in staging it, is that the ensemble is always there. So we'll have a scene right around the table, and then you'll have an ensemble member watching from here, who's not in the scene. So we have a lot of people on stage who aren't in the scene, and so we have to bring focus to where the scene is, and like the singing lessons take place here, the Dean and Martina are sitting right here at the table behind them, and ostensibly across town, in another place. So it's those kinds of setting things that are really interesting to discover as we go. As I said, the thing that means the most to me is infinite grace, and the concept of infinite grace, the concept that regardless of what regret you might have, what mistakes you might have made, grace grace is yours to be had. And that is the thing that touches me the most.